Welcome to the program. I'm Stephen Stone, Trent University Chancellor and proud alumnus. Today on Trent Talks, we're talking about the environment. And joining us are the Trent School for the Environment's Director, Dr. Shaun Watmough, and Associate Director, Dr. Stephanie Rutherford, who will be answering your questions about COVID-19 and the relationship between this pandemic and the environment. As you probably know, ever since it was founded in the mid-1960s, Trent has particularly focused on environmental research and studies, long before it was top of mind elsewhere. And in the process, Trent has established itself as one of Canada's top environmental institutions. So I'm thrilled to be joined by our faculty experts today. Professor Watmough's research focuses on the impact of acid rain, climate change, nutrient depletion, forestry, and metals on our forest and lake ecosystems. And Professor Rutherford's research and teaching interests include animal studies, environmental ethics, and the cultural politics of nature. I don't often use culture, politics, and nature all in one sentence, so we'll find out what that means. But before we begin our discussion today, we would like to first respectfully acknowledge that Trent University is situated on the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississauga Anishinaabe. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. May we honor those teachings. Shaun and Stephanie, welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm so glad we are talking about the environment. The environment was front and center in all of our minds, and then suddenly the pandemic came along and the environment seems to have taken a bit of a back seat. So it's vitally important to come back to it. Before we get into our questions from the audience, Shaun, maybe could you provide some general insight into how COVID-19 has changed our environment?
Thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here. I think you kind of hit the nail on the head there in that opening statement that the environment appears to be a very big issue in February, and then all of a sudden COVID-19 hits, and clearly we're all worried about that. I think it's important to remember that these environmental challenges that we're facing, they haven't gone away. They are still here. One thing that you do notice now, as more and more information comes out about the way COVID's affecting people's health, where the mortalities are higher. More and more we're hearing a link between climate-related issues, air quality. We're hearing stories about the resilience of nature, which is, I tend to be optimistic about things. And when you see stories or read about stories about wildlife roaming around cities now because people aren't moving around, it just goes to show you that, the huge impact that we have on the environment, but B, that if we do take efforts to restore these things, nature finds a way, and we can get through this and hopefully go towards a better world.
Well, and Stephanie, speaking of nature and animals, I was interested to find out about your focus on relations between we humans and nature and animals. Could you share a little about how animals are part of the COVID story?
Yeah, for sure. And Shaun's sort of stealing my thunder here, talking about animals in cities. But I would say the entire COVID story is about our relationship with the natural world, and certainly about animals from, there's a lot of different ways you could approach it, from the wet markets to sort of what's happening in meat processing plants right now. But I would sort of signal two things that I've been paying a lot of attention to. The first is kind of the origin story of COVID. It's a zoonotic, right? Like it's like SARS and it's like Ebola in that it jumps from animal to human. And a lot of the focus on that has been about, the answer is we need to ban the wildlife trade, but it's actually a much bigger story than that. In terms of our relationship with animals. And as we push animals further to the margins, in terms of the changes we make with the land, with things like deforestation or industrial agriculture and stuff, these animals get sort of closer to us than they might be normally. And we actually enable these transmission pathways for all sorts of zoonoses. So that's the first way. The second way, and I think this has been less talked about, is that animals will help us find the cure or the vaccine for this. And so, millions and millions of monkeys and mice will be enrolled in testing to help us find a cure or the vaccine for this. So those are the sort of two ways I'd signal right off the bat.
Oh, well, thank you both. That really sets the context. So now we can move into our audience submitted questions. And Shaun, maybe you first. How is the COVID-19 pandemic connected to existing environmental problems and issues?
Okay, Stephen, there are a number of connections. I don't want to steal Stephanie's thunder again, so I'm going to stay with animals, and I'll let Stephanie talk more about that. I'll stick with the things I perhaps know more about. I should also point out one thing that people will have seen, and if you're like me, what you'll do is you'll be checking the news updates, and every day is a new news article about something related to COVID. You know, scientists do this, they find that. And there is a lot of misinformation out there. Journalists are taking information, which is not necessarily the way scientists would take it, where we go through a rigorous peer review process and only release something once we are pretty confident. Right now, everybody's itching for some information. Sometimes it's looking for optimism from hope. Sometimes it's you're trying to get sensationalized things and that. So whenever you're looking at the information, you've got to sometimes just take a step back and consider the source. And so when we're talking about environment, I mean, the most obvious effect that we're doing is that we're not traveling. We're staying at home a lot more. And what that's led to is a huge reduction in traffic. Industries, certainly not essential industries, have been closed. So the more obvious thing is that the air quality has changed. And when we talk about air quality, there are two aspects to that. One is going to be pollution, and one which perhaps we'll talk about later is climate change. But for this question, I'll focus mostly on air pollution as the connection here, and trying to link what we know versus what may be, because that's what you see a lot of. First of all, what we do know is that emissions have decreased dramatically in most parts of the world. And what I'm talking about, gases such as nitrogen oxides, and also small particulate matter, 2.4. And while there have been a lot of deaths associated with COVID-19, I think we're close to something like 350,000 now. It's appalling. Perhaps one lesser known fact is that the World Health Organization estimates that annually, so every year, approximately 4 million people die globally related to outdoor air pollution. If you add in indoor air pollution, that's probably increases by another 3 million. And while the vast majority of these cases are in places like India and Asia, where air quality is bad, Health Canada estimates that between 5,000 and 6,000 Canadians die annually because of air pollution. Now, the difference between that and COVID is that this happens all the time, right? We accept it. And secondly, we know when someone dies because of COVID because we take a blood sample and we can identify it. When someone dies related to air pollution, we don't know. It's epidemiology. It's linking early death, a respiratory ailment, some immune response to potential exposure. And it's done through epidemiology. You won't take a blood sample and say, well, you died because of poor air quality. These are estimates, that they're not absolute numbers, and we live with that. So one thing that's happened is that the air quality has improved, and that's a good thing. I mean, that's the air that we breathe is a lot better. A recent study in Europe estimated that probably 11,000 lives will be saved this year because of improved air quality. So, you know, again, I tend to be an optimist. As much as COVID is terrible and it's invoking vast negative responses, there are some positives here that we are better air quality. People perhaps might get used to this better air quality. And one thing that we don't know is, well, what happens when restrictions are eased? What happens when we lift? Again, studies are coming out now saying that 40% of people, depending on where you are going to walk more or bike more. Not only does this improve your personal health, it improves the environmental health that you get from that. So perhaps one positive outcome is that we live in a cleaner world going forward. I don't know. The other connection that people will have seen is that air pollution predisposes you to COVID-19. A very controversial article was released prior to peer review about 4 weeks ago. And what it suggested is that mortality rates increased by about 15% for every 1 microgram per cubic meter of fine particulate matter. Again, it's a correlation study. And the problem with that is, generally speaking, higher pollution levels occur in urban centers. And in urban centers, there are many, many other factors that play into that mortality. You can't necessarily, again, you're not taking a blood test and making that connection. And so you don't know whether that's true or not, but there's a correlation that's been observed. Some people refute it, some people support it. That's one of the issues we're at. We're in early days. We're 2 months into this, and there's still a lot more to find out. And the final thing I'll say is another report that air pollution actually can aid the transfer of COVID. I mean, one thing we hear about is the 6 feet, the 2 meter distance. Don't go closer than 6 feet because of the risk of transmission. Again, studies have come out now saying that the virus particles can adhere or attach to these pollutants in the atmosphere, and pollutants can travel vast distances. And there are concerns, again, that this can aid the spread of pollution far beyond that 6 feet. Again, it's something that's out there. It's not peer reviewed. We don't know. So again, when you talk about reducing air quality, perhaps again you reduce the risk of transfer of these virus particles.
Okay, thank you for your optimism and your caution at the same time. And now, Stephanie, we've seen people yearning to enjoy the outdoors more than ever during this period of self-isolation. An interesting highlight of just how important our connection with the environment is. Now, is it an overstatement, or is COVID-19 and our response to it starting to reshape our interaction with the environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, people talk about biophilia. So it's this innate connection to and sort of affinity towards life and lifelike processes. And the idea is that people have this biophilia, that we want to be in nature. And I think it's certainly been demonstrated that there's all kinds of psychological benefits and health benefits associated with time in nature. And certainly in this moment of crisis, people are seeking out more time in nature to find calm and rejuvenation. And mental and emotional well-being. So I think there's a bit of an opportunity here in terms of how it might reshape our relationship with the natural world. And maybe there's a realization that we need nature more than we thought we did. I mean, certainly if there's one thing that COVID teaches us is that we are not invincible, right? We are affected by changes in the environment, and we are affected by our relationship with the natural world. And so there might be a message here, I think, about our impact on nature and its capacity to affect us. Now, so Shaun is much more optimistic. He's the optimist and I'm the pessimist usually in our conversations. But to highlight one thing that he pointed to in his earlier comments, there's been lots of animal activity in urban centers of late. So you see jackals in Tel Aviv, and here in Peterborough, you're seeing a lot more eastern coyotes and fox and deer. There's, the goats in Wales were a big story. They're sort of rampaging gleefully all over the place. And our newly imposed distance has revealed their proximity to us. And I think there might be something really hopeful there in terms of how we might transform our relationship with the natural world. It might prompt people to think about our responsibility to ensure that these species survive. So that's something that I'm hopeful about.
Excellent. And, it reminds me that I love that there's an optimist and a pessimist here. In my life at home, I tend to be the early adopter, leap into it optimist, and my wife is more the other way. But it really works out well because we sort of cancel each other out and then maybe find a good path in the middle. And Shaun, back to you. I mean, you were talking earlier about the reduction in air travel and I guess the reduction in vehicular traffic and how that's played a significant role in reducing the current state of air pollution. Can you talk a bit more about is it possible this reduction will have a positive, really long-term effect, looking 10 years or 20 years into the future on the environment?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Just before I answer that question, I just want to make a comment what Steph said. I was out yesterday having a walk just north of Trent, putting in a well, measuring groundwater there. And we saw something in a tree, and it was something I'd never seen before. I couldn't figure it out. It's quite a way. And I think it was a fisher. So I don't know, but just as an example, I've never seen, just as a point that I think I've seen, I don't know, it could have been something else, but from where I was standing, I couldn't think of anything else it could have been. So there you go. Things are getting closer. But to get to the question about climate, I mean, climate change, that's the big one, right? I mean, ultimately, you know, we have to do something to address climate change. If we don't, the effects of climate change on a society and a global level are going to be catastrophic. So we're hearing now that because of reduced transport, particularly airlines, reduced carbon dioxide. I didn't mention that earlier because I knew this question was coming. So here's some numbers. I think right now, carbon dioxide emissions are down by about 17% compared to what they would have been last year, which sounds like quite a lot, and it is. Depends on where you are in the world, whether it's more or more or less. That represents we're emitting as much carbon dioxide as we were about 8 or 9 years ago. So it's not dramatic. Right now, the distinction between what we're going through right now and the economic crisis of 2008, 2009 is somewhat similar in terms of reduced pollution. So yes, there's a blip. There is a decrease in CO2, which is the main gas responsible for climate change and global warming. Will that have a long-term effect? If we go back to business as usual, no, absolutely not. Right now, if we kept this concentration, we may see a change. Right now, the atmospheric CO2 is about 412 parts per million. Based on these changed emissions, it may fall by 0.25%. It's not detectable within the noise in the system. So in itself, it won't have a huge effect. The interesting thing is, will our attitudes change? Will we travel less? Are we going to do more of these Zoom meetings? Air France, for example, they're being bailed out by the government on condition that they reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 50%. So to my mind, the oil industry is suffering right now. No one's buying oil, it's stockpile. So perhaps what we need to do, again, this is the option, let's take the chance now. Let's try and diverse from fossil fuel economy, invest in other technologies that are a greener, more sustainable way forward. Let's not go back to where we were. That's not a very, very sensible, long-term sustainable view. So there's an opportunity. And that's what it is. It's not a guarantee. It will depend on how we react post-COVID-19. If we like the better air quality, if we reduce our travel, if we work from home more, if we invest in renewable resources that aren't linked directly to fossil fuels, if we perhaps alter our farming practices, there's lots of opportunities. There's a lot of innovation that is going on right now. When there's a crisis, people get innovative, and that's what we're in right now. We're in a real crisis. So I hope that the innovation that is going on, that will lead to reductions. For us to meet our Paris Agreement, for the planet to meet our Paris commitments, the level of reduction needs to be about 5% reduction per year. And that's my dog barking in the background. So we need to reduce by 5%. So I think right now we're above that, but we have to sustain that year upon year upon year. I'm hopeful that we will, but in itself, what's happened now won't have any effect.
If I could just add something too. I mean, I think the risk really, and so as Shaun has described, we're seeing all these reductions, but the risk is as we ramp up and in our desire to restart the economy, we fall back into these old ways, right? And so that's the hazard. Is it's going to be really tempting to just do things as we have always done and to try to do it really quickly to try to recover the economy. And I think we have to resist that a little bit. As Shaun said, it's an opportunity to do something different.
Well, and Stephanie, just following up on that, and let me use as an example the food industry. Up until the pandemic hit, we were getting very used to sustainable initiatives like bringing our own cups to Tim Hortons or our favorite coffee hole, or bringing our own reusable bags to the grocery store. But COVID has made us reverse course. And restaurants are refusing to fill reusable mugs, and grocery stores are back to using plastic bags. So here's the question. What long-term impact might COVID-19 have on our sustainability efforts?
And I think, yeah, great question. I think this really hits on the relationship that you signaled at the beginning between nature, culture, and politics, right? And so you're right. There was this huge groundswell against the plastics industry, which culminated in the move to ban single-use plastics by 2021. And this has now been delayed by the pandemic. But even as we emphasize safety, we have to remember that this plastic is going to go somewhere, right? And where it's likely going to end up is in the ocean and affecting marine life. And there's a lot of concern from environmentalists who think that the plastic industry is really seizing on this moment to capitalize by promoting itself by capitalizing on these public health concerns. So I think the thing that we need to do is to make sure that any move towards using plastic bags and disposable gloves and all of these sorts of things are temporary, not permanent, right? That we have to hold. So, the Environment Minister, Jonathan Wilkinson, has said that these are temporary measures, that the government remains committed to their environmental promises. And I think for the political pieces, it's our job to hold their feet to the fire on that, right? And to make sure that once the immediate crisis has passed, we ensure that the promises that they made that got them in part elected, that they continue to adhere to those promises.
Well, thank you. And thank you both. That's all the time we have today for our audience submitted questions, but there is a final question to ask each of you. And Stephanie, you're the pessimist, so I'm going to go with you first. Are there any positive lessons we can take forward from this COVID-19 time?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to be more positive than I normally am about this. And I'm sure many of you have read, there was an article that appeared in The Guardian, but also other places, by the author Arundhati Roy, who wrote The God of Small Things. And it's entitled, "The Pandemic is Portal." But the question is to where, right? And I think what the pandemic really invites is this consideration of what resilient futures might look like, that pay attention to social and environmental justice, and think about the ways that those two pieces are intertwined with one another. I would say the thing that makes me really hopeful is that it shows us that we can mobilize in a crisis, that it is possible, that we can engage in mutual aid and in solidarity with one another and with the natural world on a global scale. And so it shows us this path to deal with something like climate change or the biodiversity crisis, and that we can be bold in the ways that, and quick in the ways that we deal with these crises. And I think that this narrative that we've heard that environmental issues are too big to tackle, that doesn't really hold water anymore. We can see how we can make big change and pretty quickly. I think there also, and Shaun said this too, I think there might also be a willingness to look at the broader range of solutions, which before the pandemic might have been thought of as fringe or unthinkable. So as our supply chains are stretched, for instance, we might emphasize more local food production, or we might emphasize more local energy production. There might be more desire to protect nature and habitats, and there might be more economic programs that feel equal to everybody. So I think that there is an opportunity here to see a different kind of world.
Thank you. And Shaun, I'm sure there is a hopeful message you can leave us with today.
Well, Stephanie said. I'll be much briefer as scientists versus social scientists. I'm just going to say, at the beginning, you mentioned that environment's taken a back seat. And I think you're right at a media level or a governmental level. I would argue the opposite at the individual level. I think more and more of us, as we've gone through this, recognize the importance of a healthy environment. When we're in lockdown, we all want to be outside. We all want to go somewhere clean. We all want to breathe the air. So I think that individual reflection, acknowledgement that having a healthy environment is important for our well-being. I think we're all realizing that just that little bit more, and it's because it's the people that can drive these changes. I think that's a very powerful thing.
Well, thank you, both of you again, Stephanie and Shaun, for your insights today. And also, I was delighted that when we were talking about, getting closer to animals and seeing more animal life, that Shaun, your dog, also chimed in with some insight. Yeah. And for those of you at home, thank you for joining us. And I hope you'll tune in again next week when we welcome Dr. Haroon Akram Lodi and Dr. Colin Omanek to discuss the global impacts of COVID-19 on gender and economic justice. It's going to be fascinating. In the meantime, as always, we do want to hear your thoughts about today's program and also encourage you to submit questions for next week. You can do so by continuing the discussion on social using the hashtag Trent Talks. Until next week, stay safe, and please always remember, you are not alone. Goodbye for now.